Today, we're diving into the story of a Judean king whose entire reign became this incredible cautionary tale. We're talking about King Ahaz, and we're going to uncover the absolutely devastating price of fear. So let's start with a really big question. How does a king lose everything? I mean, think about it. You have all the power, an entire kingdom at your command. How do you end up with absolutely nothing? Well, the story of Ahaz gives us a stunningly clear step-by-step answer. And right away, we get to the heart of the problem. This verse from 2 Chronicles just lays it all out. Ahaz is only 20 years old when he takes the throne, but he immediately turns his back on the faith of his fathers. And he doesn't just slip up. He full-on sprints in the other direction. He walks in the ways of the kings of Israel, which, was basically code for widespread state-sponsored idolatry. And the scale of his unfaithfulness is just staggering. This wasn't some private weakness. He built pagan shrines all over the country, basically leading his people down the same path. But then he did something truly horrific. He sacrificed his own children, his own sons. It's the ultimate rejection of God, an embrace of the most brutal pagan rituals you can imagine. So you can probably guess what happens next. A crisis hits. The combined armies of Israel and Aram are marching on Judah, and the whole kingdom is gripped by terror. I love the imagery in this quote. It paints such a vivid picture. It's not just worry, it's this deep, paralyzing fear that shook the nation to its very core, from the king all the way down. And that fear, turns out, it was completely justified. The consequences for turning away from God were swift, and they were brutal. In a single day, Judah's army was just decimated. 120,000 soldiers were killed. Just try to wrap your head around that number. But the devastation didn't stop there. In that very same invasion, 200,000 women and children were captured, carted off to be sold as slaves. The very fabric of the nation was being ripped apart. And yet, right here, in this moment of complete and total disaster, the story pivots. God doesn't just abandon Judah. No, he sends the prophet Isaiah directly to King Ahaz with a message, an actual offer of rescue, a way out of this whole mess. And this is the promise that's laid directly at Ahaz's feet. God tells him, through Isaiah, look, stop worrying. He says these powerful kings that Ahaz is so terrified of, they're nothing. They're like two burned-out embers that are about to go out. Their big plans will fail. All Ahaz has to do is trust. And to make it even easier for Ahaz, God makes this unbelievable offer. He says, ask for a sign. Any sign you want. Make it as impossible as you can think of. It's basically a blank check for a miracle. But Ahaz's response? No, I will not test the Lord. It sounds so pious, doesn't it? But really, it's a defiant refusal to engage, a stubborn refusal to trust. He's already made up his mind. But God gives a sign anyway. And Isaiah delivers this incredibly famous prophecy, a promise that goes way beyond Ahaz and his immediate problems. The sign of Emmanuel, which means God is with us, becomes this profound declaration that God is faithful to his people, even when their king is anything but. So having rejected God's offer, Ahaz goes with his own plan. And it is a terrible one. He's so gripped by fear that he turns to a human power, the mighty Assyrian Empire. He loots the temple and his own palace for bribe money. And for a minute, it actually seems to work. Assyria captures Damascus and gives him some breathing room. But the cost is catastrophic. Judah loses its freedom and becomes a subject nation. And then, in the ultimate betrayal, the very king Ahaz paid to protect him turns around and attacks him. Now, you'd think this absolute disaster would be a wake-up call for Ahaz, right? Nope. He doubles down. While he's visiting Damascus, the capital of his now defeated enemy, he sees a pagan altar, and he likes it. He becomes fascinated by it. He sees it not as a symbol of a failed god, but as something he wants to copy. And this one decision kicks off a rapid downward spiral. First, he sends a model of this pagan altar back to Jerusalem to have it duplicated. Then, he comes back and actually offers sacrifices on it to the gods of Damascus, because he thinks they must be stronger than the God of Israel. He shoves the Lord's own altar to the side for his personal use, and then he takes the final step. He shuts the doors of the Lord's temple. He just closes up shop, completely cutting the nation off from God. So what's the final scorecard on his 16-year reign? a legacy of absolute total ruin. He threw away the empire his family had built. He subjected his people to constant attacks. He led an entire nation into sin, and he sold his country's freedom for a false sense of security that blew up in his face. In the end, he was just utterly unfaithful. His end was just as telling as his reign. Even in death, he was denied the honor given to other kings. They buried him in the city, sure, but he was pointedly kept out of the royal tombs. It was the final public verdict on his catastrophic leadership. And that brings us all the way back to our first question, but now we see it differently. Ahaz's story began with him and his people trembling like trees shaking in a storm. Every single terrible decision he made, from idolatry to that disastrous foreign policy, it was all driven by fear. It pushed him to abandon his faith, to grasp for control, and it ultimately cost him and his nation everything. So it leaves us with this one last thing to think about. What really is the true cost of fear?